Holy hands, dirty deeds. The flesh is weak. Pastor Roberts came harder than he had in months, his thick fingers gripping the motel bedspread, his sweaty back arching as he let out a deep, guttural moan. Oh, sweet Jesus. Samuel, still on his knees between the pastor's trembling thighs, looked up with a smirk. You sure do call his name a lot when you're sinning, Pastor. Robert's breath was still ragged, his body twitching with the aftershocks of pleasure. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. His thighs trembled as he tried to gather himself, but shame was already creeping in, curling around his chest like a vice. He shouldn't be here. Not in this dingy motel room. Not with a 19-year-old between his legs. Not when, in less than an hour, he was supposed to be standing at the pulpit, thundering about righteousness. Yet here he was, sticky with sin. He yanked a pillow over his face, muffling a groan. His breath was hot against the fabric, the scent of cheap detergent mixing with the musk of sweat and sex. What the hell was wrong with him? Samuel chuckled, standing up and stretching his lean, toned body catching the soft glow of the flickering motel light. Relax, Pastor. Ain't nobody gonna find out. Robert sat up fast, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He reached for his boxers, hands still shaking as he yanked them up. You need to get dressed and get out of here. Samuel just smirked. What's the rush? Church ain't for another 45 minutes. The bedside clock glowed an angry red. 8:15 a.m. Roberts cursed under his breath. He grabbed his phone, his stomach twisting as he saw the unread text message from his wife. Where are you? You better not be late to church again. His jaw clenched. The sweat on his skin felt cold now, dirty. He rubbed his face, exhaling hard. He needed to get out of here, needed to clean up, put on his suit, and stand before his congregation like he hadn't just spent the morning on his knees before a different kind of altar. Samuel flopped back onto the bed, running a lazy hand down his stomach. Man, I don't know why you fight it so hard. You know you're going to come crawling back next time you get that itch. Robert snapped his belt back into place, tightening it around his waist. His hands were steady now. His face was cold, unreadable. This is the last time, he muttered. Samuel let out a loud, dramatic laugh. Oh, yeah, you said that before. And yet here we are. Roberts didn't answer, because the boy was right. Instead, he grabbed his Bible from the chair, tucking it under his arm like a shield, and stormed out the door. He had a sermon to give, and a whole lot of praying to do. Part 2, fire and brimstone, and maybe a little pre-cum. Pastor Roberts smelled like sin. No amount of drugstore cologne or gas station wet wipes could erase the sticky remnants of Samuel's lips, tongue, and sweat from his skin. His suit was freshly pressed, his Bible tucked under his arm. But beneath it all, he was still a filthy, depraved man. As he gripped the steering wheel, his fingers trembled. 8:57 a.m. 3 minutes until church started. 3 minutes until he had to stand at the pulpit, look these people in the eyes, and preach against the very sin he just spent the night drowning in. Lord, forgive me, he muttered under his breath, even as his body still ached from Samuel's touch. He pulled into the church parking lot, barely putting the truck in park before his wife, Ellen, stormed up to him, her heels clicking against the pavement like a ticking time bomb. You reeks of cologne, Robert, she hissed, hands on her hips. Where the hell have you been? He forced a tight-lipped smile. Prayer meeting. Private. Needed to commune with the Lord. Her eyes narrowed. You better not have been drinking again. I wasn't drinking, he snapped, voice cracking slightly. Just sucking off a 19-year-old in a dingy motel room. Ellen glared at him a second longer, then sighed. The choir's already started. Just get inside. He followed her into the church, past rows of devoted believers, the same ones who praise him for his moral leadership, while turning a blind eye to their own sins. He took his place at the pulpit, gripping the edges with both hands. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it, cleared his throat, and then he unleashed hell. The devil is among us, brothers and sisters. Robert's voice boomed through the microphone, bouncing off the wooden rafters of the church. Sin lurks in shadows. Temptation waits at every corner. The weak will give in, but the faithful must fight. He pounded his fist on the pulpit for emphasis. The congregation ate it up, heads nodding, amens echoing through the room. His phone buzzed again. He clenched his jaw and ignored it. We live in a world where men, weak, lost men, turn away from God's plan, where they give in to unnatural desires. Another buzz, then another. Heat crawled up his neck as he pressed on, louder, angrier. But these urges are a test, my friends, a test to see who is strong in the eyes of the Lord and who is a slave to their own depravity. A final buzz, then a ding, a text. He shouldn't have looked, but he did. Glancing down just for a second, he saw the glowing screen in his pocket, Samuel's name, and the message beneath it. You look so cute moaning for me last night. Smiling face with horns, you sure you're not the one who's a slave to depravity, Pastor? His throat dried up. He looked up, eyes darting over the congregation, suddenly paranoid that someone else had seen. But no one was paying attention to his panic, only to his sermon. And then he saw him, Samuel, standing in the very back, leaning against a doorway, arms crossed, smirking. He was dressed too casually for church. Tight jeans, a fitted t-shirt that clung to his lean frame, a silver chain dangling at his throat. He looked like a walking temptation, a devil in boy's clothing. And worse, he licked his lips, slow, deliberate. Roberts gripped the pulpit tighter, knuckles turning white. And those who give in, he continued, voice straining as he forced himself not to look back at Samuel, shall burn for their sins. Samuel winked. Pastor Roberts nearly dropped his Bible. Temptation behind closed doors. Pastor Roberts' hands shook as he closed his Bible. He could still feel the burn of Samuel's eyes on him. The way Samuel's smirk lingered in his mind long after the sermon ended. The words of Scripture felt like sandpaper against his skin, scratching at a wound he couldn't stop picking at. Amen, he muttered, though he felt nothing but the weight of his guilt. He turned to walk off the pulpit, but before he could make it to the back hallway, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Samuel. Great sermon, Pastor. The voice was low and smooth, like honey sliding over his spine. Samuel's body leaned just a little too close, his breath tickling the back of Robert's neck. The pastor stiffened, forcing himself not to react. He had to stay composed. He had to stay strong. But Samuel wasn't letting him. You didn't mention the part about temptation, though, Samuel continued, his eyes glinting with mischief. You know, the part where the devil comes in all kinds of forms? Maybe like a nice young thing who knows exactly what buttons to push. Roberts froze, his chest tightening. He tried to force a smile, but it felt like a mask that would crack any second. This isn't the place, Samuel, he muttered, glancing around. The last thing he needed was someone walking in on them. But Samuel didn't move away. Instead, he leaned closer, his lips brushing Robert's ear. I don't think it matters where we are. You can't get me out of your head, can you, Pastor? The words sent a bolt of heat straight through Robert's core, and he cursed under his breath. How was it possible to feel this weak? Samuel's hand slid down Robert's arm, warm and deliberate, and the pastor couldn't stop the involuntary shiver that ran through him. His heart was pounding now, every thrum a reminder of his own failure. I'll be waiting for you in the back, Samuel said, his voice breathy with promise. He gave Roberts a wink before walking away, leaving him standing there, rooted to the floor, fighting the urge to follow. The hallway felt cold and empty as Roberts moved through it, the echoes of his footsteps haunting him like the judgment of 1,000 eyes. He was supposed to be a man of God, a leader, someone whose morality was above reproach. But in that moment, as his hand brushed the door to the back office, all he could think about was the young man who had broken him. The door clicked shut behind him with a soft but final sound. Samuel was sitting there, waiting on the couch in the small office, his legs casually spread, the fabric of his jeans taut over his thighs. He was still wearing the same tight shirt, the one that hugged every curve of his lean body. It was too much. Robert's pulse quickened. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself, but Samuel's presence was overwhelming. I thought we'd be alone this time, Samuel teased, his voice light and dripping with amusement. No sermon, no distractions. Roberts took a step back, trying to collect himself. I shouldn't be doing this. But Samuel only laughed. You're already doing it, Pastor. Every time you think about me, you're doing it. His tone was low and suggestive, and it made Robert's breath catch. Samuel was playing him, teasing him with every word, every glance. You've been a bad boy, Samuel murmured, his voice thick with intent. Trying to fight it, but I can see it, Pastor. I can see how much you want this. Robert's breath faltered. He did want it. He couldn't deny it. Not anymore. Samuel knew how to push his buttons, how to make him feel like he was losing control. The younger man stood, slowly, taking his time. With each step he took toward Roberts, the older man's resolve weakened. Samuel was everything Roberts wasn't supposed to want. Handsome, confident, free. Samuel stopped just inches away, his lips curling into a knowing smile. You don't have to be ashamed, he whispered. Not anymore. I can make you feel good. You deserve to feel good. Before Roberts could respond, Samuel reached forward, pulling the pastor into him. The kiss was quick but intense, hungry, as if Samuel were trying to devour him, and Roberts let him, his mouth opening in surprise as Samuel's hand slid down to his waist, pulling him closer. It was too much. It was like being set on fire, and for a moment, Roberts almost forgot where they were, almost forgot who he was supposed to be. But then, a sharp rattle at the door, the unmistakable sound of someone outside. Roberts pulled away, his heart racing. No, we can't. Someone will hear. But Samuel didn't stop. He just gave the door one last glance and then smirked at Roberts. If they hear, let them hear, he said, voice low and dangerous. We're both sinners, right? Samuel grabbed the back of Robert's head and kissed him again, harder this time, pulling him into a deep, insistent kiss. And Roberts? He didn't stop it. Part 4, an unlikely alliance. Present day. Samuel stood before Roberts in the dimly lit church office, his eyes locking with the pastor's. There was a calm intensity in the air, but the underlying tension was thick enough to cut through. Samuel's breath was slow, measured, and the dangerous game he was playing seemed to be shifting. His usual manipulative charm had evolved into something far more dangerous. His words now carried a weight that pulled Roberts in deeper, not just with lust, but with a promise of understanding, of freedom from the guilt and shame Roberts had carried for so long. Samuel, leaning closer, voice soft yet intense. I wasn't always like this, Roberts. I grew up just like you, sitting in the pews, listening to the fire and brimstone. My father was a preacher, and he made sure I knew that I was nothing but a stain, a disgrace. I was taught to hate myself for who I am, for the things I felt, the things I wanted. Robert swallowed hard, the confession hitting him with an unexpected wave of empathy. He had heard this kind of story before, the tragedy of someone living in secrecy, forced to suppress desires. Yet, hearing it from Samuel, someone had tried to keep at arm's length, made it all feel dangerously real. Roberts, his voice shaky, uncertain. But, Samuel, how does this make what we're doing right? You want me to be like you? To throw away everything I believed in? Samuel, eyes darkening, the faintest trace of bitterness flickering across his face. No, I want you to be free. I want you to stop hiding. Because I've seen you, Roberts. I see the way you look at me. The way you pretend it doesn't matter. But I know it does. The weight of Samuel's words hung between them, making Roberts feel exposed. He wanted to pull away, to shout that this wasn't him, that he wasn't like Samuel, lost in the guilt and temptation. But as Samuel stepped closer, the space between them narrowing, Roberts found himself paralyzed. Samuel, his voice softer now, almost pleading. You don't have to be trapped in that cage anymore. I'm not your enemy. I'm the one who understands you, the one who sees who you really are. It was then that Samuel's past began to unravel in Robert's mind, his words slowly turning into echoes of a distant memory. The scene faded into something much older, deeper. Flashback to Samuel's past. Setting, a modest house. The dim glow of a single lamp illuminating Samuel's face. He was young, maybe 16, eyes still wide with confusion. His bedroom was cluttered with books and religious trinkets, symbols of the world he had been forced to live in. The sounds of shouting came from a hallway. His father's voice, harsh and unrelenting. pierced the stillness. Father, off-screen, shouting, "The Lord says, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. Do you hear me, Samuel?" Young Samuel stood frozen by the window, looking out into the night, hoping to escape the anger that filled the air. His face twisted in discomfort, trying to suppress the feelings that had begun to stir within him. He had tried, for so long, to push them away, but no matter how hard he prayed, the desire didn't go away. It only grew stronger. Young Samuel, whispering to himself, "Why am I like this? Why can't I be like them?" The door slammed open, and his father stormed into the room, his large frame blocking the only exit. Father, fuming, "You are an abomination, Samuel. You will not disgrace this family with your desires. Do you think God will forgive you for this?" Samuel's body trembled with fear and shame. His father's words cut through him, but the feeling he couldn't escape was stronger than anything his father could say. Back to the present. Samuel, his voice now calm, almost wistful. "You see, Roberts, I wasn't always like this. I used to pray away, just like you probably do. I used to believe their words. I believed that I was broken, but they were the ones who were wrong. They were the ones who taught me shame. They took away my ability to love myself for who I truly am." Roberts felt a chill run down his spine, but it wasn't the usual disgust he had for Samuel. It was something else, a deeper understanding, a connection that he had never felt before. He could see the way Samuel had been broken by the same system he had been raised in, the same system that had always told them both they were wrong for simply existing. Samuel, voice almost a whisper now, intense and vulnerable. "I want to help you, Roberts. I want to show you that this doesn't have to be the end of you. It doesn't have to destroy you like it destroyed me. You can break free, and I'll be here with you, but only if you let me." Samuel's words hung in the air, thick with the weight of everything he had said. Roberts could feel the pull, the temptation to cross the line that had always been so clearly drawn. But he was afraid of losing everything he had built, afraid of becoming what Samuel had become. Yet, in Samuel's eyes, Robert saw something else. A man who had been crushed under the weight of his own guilt. A man who had found a way to survive, twisted though it might have been. Roberts, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can." Samuel, leaning in, his face softening. "You don't have to know yet. Just take my hand, Roberts. Trust me, I promise we'll make it together." Consequences and fallout. Setting, Robert's church, a Sunday morning service. The congregation was buzzing with the usual Sunday chatter as people filed in for service. Robert stood at the pulpit, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he adjusted his tie. He looked out over the faces in the crowd, but today, his mind wasn't focused on the sermon he was about to deliver. His thoughts were consumed by Samuel, by the secret they shared. The weight of it was suffocating. For a brief moment, Roberts considered walking away from it all. He could leave the church, leave the town, start fresh somewhere far away. But the guilt and the desire were too strong, and deep down he knew he was trapped. As the service began, Roberts tried to steady himself, but he could feel eyes on him. They were watching, but not just the way they normally did. He could sense that something was different. Something had shifted. People were talking, whispers in the pews. He couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in. Later that day, Robert's office. The knock on his office door was unexpected, but not unwelcome. It was Elder Harris, a longtime member of the congregation, who had always had a sharp eye for detail. The man had a way of seeing right through people, and Roberts could feel his eyes on him even as he greeted him at the door. Elder Harris, eyeing Roberts carefully. "Pastor Roberts, may I have a word?" Roberts forced a smile, trying to hide the anxiety creeping up his spine. He motioned for Harris to sit. Roberts, nervously. "Of course, Elder Harris. What's on your mind?" Elder Harris leaned forward, his gaze never leaving Roberts. The silence was tense, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, Elder Harris spoke, his voice low and measured. "Elder Harris, I've noticed a change in you, Pastor. You've been distant, distracted. Your sermons, they don't have the same fire. What's going on? Are you okay? For a split second, Roberts considered lying, telling Harris everything was fine, that he was just tired. But the way Harris was looking at him so keenly made him hesitate. The suspicion in the elder's eyes was unmistakable. Roberts, feeling cornered, but trying to maintain control. It's nothing, really, just some personal things I've been dealing with. Elder Harris, raising an eyebrow. Personal things? Roberts swallowed. The words felt like they were lodged in his throat. He couldn't lie, not anymore. Not to someone who saw through him so easily. Setting. Samuel's influence grows stronger. Meanwhile, Samuel was biding his time, watching from the shadows as Roberts struggled. He knew that sooner or later, the walls would start closing on the pastor. They already were. Samuel wasn't just satisfied with their secret encounters anymore. He wanted more. He wanted control, and he wanted to see Roberts unravel, piece by piece. It was becoming clear to Samuel that Roberts wasn't strong enough to walk away from him. Each passing day, the pastor was more wrapped up in the affair, more drawn to Samuel's dangerous allure. It was like a drug, and Roberts was getting addicted. Samuel could sense it, and he liked it. The first sign of fallout, a whisper campaign. At first, it was subtle, a few comments here and there. People in the church started noticing how Roberts seemed different, how he was distracted, how his once strong faith seemed to waver. It didn't take long for the rumors to start circulating, and as they spread, Roberts could feel the pressure building. He had always thought he could keep his secret safe, but now, it felt like every step he took was being watched, every decision was being questioned. His marriage to his wife, Elaine, was starting to fray. She noticed a change in him. She noticed the way he avoided her touch, the way he came home late more often. But Roberts was too deep in his own turmoil to confront the reality of what was happening. The catalyst, the scandalous photo. Then, one day, everything changed. A photo surfaced online. It wasn't a clear shot, but it was enough to raise suspicion. Roberts and Samuel had met in secret, at a hotel at the edge of town, and someone had caught a glimpse of them. The photo was blurry, but the implication was clear. The pastor, the man who preached so passionately about sin, was involved in something far darker. Robert saw the photo late one night, his hands shaking as he stared at the image on his phone screen. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment everything would come crashing down. He deleted the photo, but it didn't matter. It had already been shared. The damage was done. The confrontation, Roberts and Elaine. That night, Roberts came home late, his mind a storm of panic. Elaine was sitting in the living room, her arms crossed. The look on her face said it all. Elaine, voice trembling. "I know, Roberts. I know what you've been doing." Roberts froze. The words hit him harder than he expected. Roberts quietly. Elaine, cutting him off, tears in her eyes. "Don't lie to me, Roberts. I've seen the photos. I know what's going on." The silence between them was suffocating. Roberts wanted to speak, to explain, but he couldn't find the words. His guilt, his shame, they had caught up to him, and now there was no way out. The fallout in the church. Back at the church, the whispers grew louder. People were talking openly now, questioning Robert's integrity, his ability to lead. Elder Harris had gathered a small group of concerned parishioners, and it was clear that a confrontation was inevitable. The church was a place of judgment, and Roberts knew he was about to face the consequences of his actions. The breaking point. Samuel, in his own twisted way, knew this would happen. It was part of the plan, part of the game. But even as Robert's life was falling apart, Samuel couldn't help but feel a strange sense of victory. He had played his part well, and now he was ready for whatever came next. Impact on the story. The fallout from Robert's affair with Samuel isn't just a scandal. It's the collapse of everything he had worked for. His marriage, his career, and his place in the church are all on the line. As the consequences started to take shape, Roberts was faced with decision. Will he own up to his actions and face the fallout, or will he continue to spiral deeper into the destructive relationship with Samuel? The pressure is mounting, and the story is headed toward a breaking point. The unraveling continues. Setting: the town's coffee shop midweek morning. Robert stood in line at the local coffee shop, a place he used to frequent for a quick pick-me-up before a long day of preaching. The familiar hum of chatter filled the air, but today, it felt like 1,000 eyes were on him. The whispers had only grown louder since the scandal broke. People would smile at him in a way that felt too knowing, too smug. The regulars who used to greet him with "Good morning, Pastor," now gave him sidelong glances as if he were a circus animal. His hands trembled as he reached for his coffee, the hot cup burning his skin, but he barely noticed. It was a perfect metaphor for his life right now. Burning on the inside, but putting on a facade to look normal. Barista, cheerily, trying to mask the awkwardness. "Here's your usual, Pastor Roberts. Looks like you're going to need it today." Roberts forced a smile, nodding as he accepted the coffee. But it wasn't the caffeine he needed to wake up. It was an escape. Somewhere, anywhere, far away from the small town where everyone seemed to know his every move. Setting, Robert's church, a week later. By now, the town was practically buzzing with gossip. Robert's once quiet, reverent church had become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. He was no longer the revered figure the moral compass the community had looked up to. Now, he was the punchline of every joke. The church pews were emptier than ever. His sermons felt like rehearsed lines, his words hollow, but Roberts couldn't back out now. He had been the pastor for too long. He had built this church from the ground up, the guilt from his affair with Samuel weighed heavily. But there was something even stronger than that. The need for control, the need to keep the facade intact. As he looked out over the congregation, he noticed the elderly woman in the front row, Mrs. McKinley, an old firecracker who'd been coming to the church for decades. She was no longer just quietly knitting. She was glaring at Roberts with eyes that could burn a hole through him. The town was divided, and some wanted him gone, but others just couldn't look away. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. The revelation, or is it? Setting, Robert's living room, late evening. Back at home, Robert sat in his living room, staring at the TV, though he wasn't really watching it. He could barely hear the sounds of the sitcom on the screen over the thoughts racing through his mind. Elaine, his wife, sat in the corner, flipping through a magazine with an air of disinterest. For the first time in a long while, Roberts had a moment of clarity. Perhaps it was a steady decline of his career. Perhaps it was a realization that he'd been living a double life for so long. He had no idea who he really was anymore. Roberts, with sudden realization. What if the real joke is on me? Elaine didn't even look up from her magazine. Elaine nonchalantly. "What's that, honey?" Roberts, with a sarcastic laugh. The whole thing, this whole church, this whole image, this whole charade. Maybe I'm just a punchline of someone else's joke. Elaine paused, lowered the magazine, and gave him a tired look. Elaine dryly. "Well, you did ask for it, didn't you? You wanted the power, the status, and now look at you." At that moment, Roberts couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It wasn't even a sad laugh. It was just a hollow, bitter laugh. He'd spent years building this reputation, this kingdom of false piety, only for it to all come crashing down in a scandal of his own making. He'd always thought he was the one in control. But now, he was nothing more than a puppet dangling from strings that were far outside his reach. Setting, the church, Sunday morning. As Robert stepped onto the pulpit that Sunday, he could hear the murmurs of the congregation. They were waiting, watching. But instead of the usual fire and brimstone sermon he had been preparing for the past few weeks, something strange happened. Roberts found himself improvising. Roberts, with a mock serious tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you today not as a pastor, not as a man of faith, but as a character in the greatest satire of all time. Yes, I've sinned. Yes, I've made mistakes. But who here hasn't?" The crowd was stunned into silence, unsure if Roberts was being serious or sarcastic. "Roberts," gesturing wildly. "This whole thing, this whole town, this church, it's a setup, a perfectly scripted act. And the joke's on all of us. I've been playing the part of the saint. But guess what? I'm just as flawed as the rest of you." The awkward silence stretched on, but then, slowly, a few members of the congregation began to chuckle. The absurdity of it all hit them. The solemn, revered Pastor Roberts was now admitting he was nothing but a character in a satire, the satirical climax. Setting the church after the service. As the service ended, the congregation filed out, their heads spinning. Some people were shocked by the pastor's sudden shift in tone, but others saw it for what it truly was, a moment of unintentional brilliance. Elder Harris, approaching Roberts with a wry smile. "Well, Pastor, I have to say that was the twist." Roberts shrugged, looking almost amused himself. Roberts grinning. "You know what? Maybe it's time for all of us to stop pretending. This church, this community, it's a sitcom, and we've all been actors in it, playing our parts." Elder Harris, laughing dryly. "I've never heard it put like that, Pastor." Roberts, with a smirk. "It's all a show, my friend. The sooner we admit it, the easier it'll be to laugh at ourselves." Setting, Town Square, a few days later. The scandal had become the town's running joke. People would pass Roberts in the street and wave, not with the solemn respect of before, but with a smirk, as though they were all in on the joke together. Roberts had lost his status as the community's moral leader, but in a strange twist, he had gained something else. The town's acceptance of his imperfections. Elaine, on their porch, holding a glass of wine. "Well, at least you finally learned how to laugh at yourself." Roberts, grinning. "Yeah, I guess I've been the punchline all along." As the sun set over the small town, Roberts and Elaine sat together, no longer burdened by the facade. The weight of the scandal had lifted, replaced by the realization that life was, in the end, just one big satire, a comedy of errors, full of absurdity and ridiculousness. And so, Roberts learned the ultimate lesson, that sometimes the only way to survive is to laugh at yourself, because in the end, what else is there to do? The end, a satirical reflection. The story ends with Roberts embracing the absurdity of life and the fall of his church as nothing more than the punchline of a long, drawn-out joke. His struggle for power, his affair, and the scandal became part of the town's lore, as people learned to laugh at their own mistakes, their own flaws. After all, what is life if not a big, messy comedy? And sometimes, the best way to handle fallout is with a good laugh and a glass of wine in hand.